Why certain people drain your energy instantly. Carl Jung observed that the people who exhaust us most completely are rarely strangers. They are the ones who seem to know exactly where to press, without ever being told. As Jung wrote in Ion, when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside. As fate, and he meant something very precise by that, not a mystical warning but a clinical observation, that whatever you have not looked at inside yourself does not vanish, it simply waits for you, wearing a face that is not your own. And that is why a certain person can walk into a room and take the air out of it before they have said a single word. The exhaustion you feel is not random weather. It is unfinished business arriving on time. So let me ask you to sit with 3 small admissions before we go further. The first is this: I notice the person who drains me long before I understand why they do. The second is this: I am willing to consider that the drain is not only coming from them. The third is this: I choose to bring my own reactions into the light instead of blaming the weather of other people forever. And now say it with me: I make the unconscious conscious. And once more, slower this time: I make the unconscious conscious. If something in you just went a little quiet hearing that, if some private exhaustion suddenly had a name, type the 2 words, "face it," in the comments. Let it be your marker for the door we are about to open. The first key is this: the drain you feel is measuring the size of the hook, not the size of the person. Most people assume that if someone exhausts them instantly, that person must simply be exhausting, difficult, toxic, draining by nature. And sometimes, yes, a situation is genuinely demanding, a deadline is real, a loss is real, ordinary tiredness is honest and needs no theory at all. But there is a second kind of drain, the instant kind, the kind that hits you before any facts have even been exchanged. And that kind is not measuring them, it is measuring you. Jung spent decades studying what he called projection, the process by which something unclaimed inside a person gets thrown outward and lands on someone else's face. And here is the quiet diagnostic he left us. The test is not whether you dislike someone. Plenty of dislike is proportionate and mild and forgettable by dinner. The test is disproportion, when the reaction is bigger than the moment could possibly justify. When a stranger's tone of voice or a co-worker's habit of interrupting sends a jolt through you that outweighs the actual event, something else is happening underneath. Imagine a woman who cannot say why a particular colleague leaves her feeling hollowed out within minutes. The colleague has done nothing dramatic, a slightly clipped email, a slightly loud laugh, and yet the exhaustion is total, disproportionate, out of scale with the facts. That gap between the size of the event and the size of the reaction is the signal. It is not proof of the other person's power. It is proof that a hook is already in you, waiting to be caught. Think for a moment of how ordinary this looks from the outside. Nobody watching would call it strange. A woman simply seems tired after a meeting. A man simply seems short-tempered on his drive home. Nothing about the surface tells you that a disproportion has occurred at all. And that is exactly why this key is so easy to miss for years. The drain hides inside what looks like an entirely normal reaction. Imagine a man who dreads a particular weekly phone call from an old friend. The friend is not cruel, is not even especially demanding, asks after his week, tells a few stories, and yet the man finds himself staring at his phone for a full minute before answering, and afterward feels strangely wrung out, as though the call had cost him far more than 20 minutes of talking. If you asked him what was said, he could barely tell you, because the content was never really the point. The size of his dread and the size of the actual conversation do not match, and that mismatch is the whole clue, sitting there in plain view, waiting to be noticed rather than explained away as simply being tired that week. This is not comfortable news at first. It can feel like it lets the other person off entirely. But notice what it actually offers. If the drain were only about them, you would be at their mercy forever, permanently waiting for them to change before you could feel any different. But if the drain is also about the hook, then something in this equation is finally within your own reach, not because you caused their behavior, but because your reaction to it has a size, and a size can be examined. So today, without any performance of self-blame, just notice the next disproportion, the flash of exhaustion too large for its cause, the dread too heavy for the actual conversation, and let that be the doorway rather than the verdict, not a confession of weakness, but a small piece of evidence, quietly pointing inward. I do not confuse the size of my reaction with the size of the truth. The second key is this: what drains you outward always began as something unclaimed inward. Jung wrote in Ion that projections change the world into the replica of one's own unknown face. And that sentence deserves to be read twice, because it is not saying the world is an illusion, it is saying the world becomes a mirror whether you consent to it or not. The parts of yourself you have not acknowledged do not stay quietly inside you. They go looking for a face to wear, and the face they choose is rarely random. It tends to be the co-worker, the relative, the acquaintance, who happens to carry some faint resemblance to what you have buried. Jung told a story from his own travels that has stayed with generations of readers since. He sat with a Pueblo elder named Ochwai Biano, who told him plainly that the whites always want something. They are always uneasy and restless. And Jung asked why he thought that was so, and the chief said it was because the whites think with their heads. Jung took this as a mirror held up to the whole of European civilization. Not an insult, but a diagnosis. An outside eye seeing what the inside eye, too close and too identified, could not. This is the shape of every instant drain. The other person becomes, for a moment, the outside eye you did not ask for, showing you a face you had not acknowledged as your own. Consider how ordinary this looks in practice. Imagine a man who works in an open office, and there is one colleague whose habit of finishing other people's sentences leaves him quietly furious every single time. He has told himself for a year that it is simply rudeness, that anyone would feel this way. But one evening he notices something small. At home, with his own children, he does the very same thing. He finishes their sentences before they can. He tells himself it is only helpfulness, only impatience with a slow morning, and the moment he sees the two side by side, the colleague and himself, something shifts. The fury does not vanish, but it loses its strange, oversized weight, because he has caught the mirror in the act. The colleague was never the whole cause of the exhaustion. The colleague was simply standing in the right spot, wearing the right expression, to catch the light of something the man had never looked at in himself. This is what Jung meant when he wrote that we discover in our neighbor whatever it is that we do not want to know about ourselves. Discover is the word to hold on to, not invent, not imagine. Discover, as though it were there all along waiting to be found. And notice too that the mirror rarely announces itself politely. It does not knock, it simply appears in the shape of an ordinary person doing an ordinary thing, and the disproportion of your own reaction is the only clue you are given. So the second key does not ask you to excuse anyone's conduct. People do have real qualities, real edges, real behavior worth naming honestly, but it asks you to notice that the exhaustion has a mirror quality running underneath it. That something about their face has become, briefly, borrowed, the replica of your own unknown face. Standing in a room you have not fully entered yet, I let the mirror show me before I decide what it means. The third key is this: the drain has a schedule, and if you follow it for one ordinary day, the pattern becomes impossible to unsee. Pause for a moment and pick one real person, someone whose presence tends to leave you strangely tired. Not a villain, just a name that comes to mind easily. And now imagine tracking a single day around them the way Jung might have tracked a patient's reactions in his clinical notebooks. At 8 in the morning, you see their name in your inbox, and something in your chest tightens before you have even opened the message. At 10, you pass them in a hallway, and your voice becomes slightly higher, slightly more careful than it is with anyone else that day. At noon, a friend mentions their name over lunch, and you find yourself talking for 4 minutes about one small thing they did, far longer than the thing deserves. At 3 in the afternoon, you catch yourself replaying a sentence they said last week, turning it over for the 5th time. At 6, you notice you are more tired than the day's actual workload explains. And you tell yourself it was simply a long day. And then at 9 that night, lying in bed, you notice the sentence is still there, uninvited, running its small loop one more time before sleep finally takes it from you. Now look at that whole day laid end to end. The tightening, the caution, the over-talking, the replaying, the unexplained fatigue, the late-night echo, none of these were caused by a single dramatic event. They were caused by a low current running underneath ordinary hours. And that current has a name. Jung would have called it a complex operating quietly, a cluster of feeling and memory that gets touched and then runs on its own, borrowing your attention without asking permission. In his early clinical work, Jung actually measured this with a stopwatch, giving patients a list of plain words and timing how long it took them to answer each one. And certain words, ordinary words, would make the hand hesitate, the breath catch, the answer come slow, not because the word itself was dangerous, but because it had brushed against a splinter of feeling already lodged beneath the surface. Your day around this one name is the same test running in slow motion. Each small tightening is the hand hesitating on the stopwatch. Imagine a man who cannot explain why one particular relative empties him within minutes of every visit. Nothing said is unusual, nothing done is cruel. And still he leaves feeling hollowed. And when he finally sits with it honestly, he notices that the relative carries a certain tone of quiet disapproval that he associates, going all the way back, with being found not quite good enough. The exhaustion was never really about the visit. The visit was simply the stage on which an old scene kept quietly replaying. Or imagine a woman who notices that every message from a particular colleague gets read twice before she can answer it, once for the words, and once for a tone she is certain must be hiding underneath them, though nothing in the message actually proves that tone exists. That second reading is not information. It is the complex checking its own old wound before allowing her to respond. This is the heart of the third key. Before you can withdraw anything, you first have to see the shape of what has been running, not in theory, but across an actual day, actual minutes, actual small tightenings you can name. So try the exercise honestly this week. Pick the one name, and simply notice, without judging, the small physical and mental tolls it takes across a normal day. The tension in the shoulders before a call, the extra rehearsal of a sentence, the fatigue that arrives without enough cause, the sentence that follows you into the evening uninvited. Write it down if you can, hour by hour if you are willing, because a pattern named on paper loses some of its grip the moment it is finally written in daylight. I trace the pattern before I try to change it. The fourth key is this: the way through is not distance, it is withdrawal. And those two words are so often confused that most people never even notice they have chosen the wrong one. Withdrawal, in Jung's sense, does not mean cutting someone off, going cold, disappearing from their life, as though they were the entire problem. That would simply be trading one kind of unconsciousness for another, a new arrangement of furniture in the same dark room. Withdrawal means something quieter and considerably harder. It means taking back the psychic energy you have loaned to the outer situation and carrying it home to where it actually belongs. Think of it like a debt you did not know you were owed. Every time the instant drain happens, a portion of your attention, your feeling, your inner charge has been sent outward and parked on someone else's account, and the fatigue you feel afterward is partly the fatigue of energy that is simply not where it should be, spent maintaining a story that is only half about the person standing in front of you. Withdrawal asks a very unglamorous question in the quiet of your own evening. Not what is wrong with them, but what is it in me that keeps recognizing itself over there? And it asks that question without asking you to like the answer right away. Imagine a man who spends every family dinner bracing for one particular in-law. The moment she walks in the room, his shoulders climb toward his ears. His sentences shorten. He finds himself agreeing to things he does not mean simply to end the exchange sooner. For years he explains this to himself as her personality. She is difficult. She is cold. She makes everyone tense. And there is truth in that. She is not an easy woman. But one evening, Driving home, exhausted in that particular hollowed way, he finally asks himself Jung's quieter question instead of the easier one. And what surfaces, slowly, uncomfortably, is an old memory of being measured and found wanting by someone else entirely. A teacher, a parent, a much earlier voice. The in-law had simply inherited that old assignment, without ever applying for the job. He did not stop seeing her. He did not confront her. He did not even tell her anything at all. What he did was smaller and stranger. He stopped feeding the old scene every time she entered a room, and slowly, dinner by dinner, the bracing eased, not because she changed, but because he had quietly walked his own energy back home. This is the whole difference between distance and withdrawal. Distance rearranges where people stand. Withdrawal rearranges where your energy lives, and only one of those actually empties the hook. Some situations do call for real boundaries, real distance, real caution. A person can be genuinely unsafe or genuinely unkind, and no amount of inner work changes that plain fact. But even then, the withdrawal has to happen first, or you simply carry the old charge with you into every future room. Still exhausted, only now blaming a different face for the very same debt. I bring my energy home before I decide what distance I need. Before we go further, if this way of seeing people is new to you, consider staying near this channel for what comes next. There is a great deal more of Jung's map still ahead, and I would rather you did not miss it. The fifth key is the deepest one, and it comes in 4 pieces, so let us take them slowly, one at a time, without rushing past any of them. First, consider why the drain lands on this particular face and not another, because it never lands evenly. You can sit across from 100 strangers on a train and feel nothing at all. Ordinary neutral tiredness at most, and then one particular person, on one particular evening, hollows you out in 90 seconds flat. That specificity is not an accident, and it is not bad luck either. Jung's whole clinical method rested on the observation that what he called a complex, once formed, has content, it has texture, it has a very particular shape, almost like a key cut for one lock only, and it will only attach itself to a hook that matches that shape closely enough to fit. Imagine a woman sitting at a family dinner. Her uncle across the table laughs a certain way, loud, sudden, slightly mocking at the edges, and something in her chest drops before dessert is even served. Meanwhile, her cousin, sitting right beside the uncle, barely notices the laugh at all. Same table, same sound, same room, and yet one person is drained and the other is simply eating. The laugh itself cannot be the explanation, since it landed on both of them equally. The difference has to be in the woman herself, in some old scene already alive in her, perhaps a childhood table where laughter like that meant she was about to be the joke rather than part of it. And that old scene, not tonight's dinner, is what is actually doing the draining. This is why simply avoiding that uncle, skipping every gathering, changes nothing underneath. The shape is still inside her, patient, waiting for the next face that happens to fit it well enough. And here is the part most people miss entirely. The fit does not have to be exact, it only has to be close enough. A certain angle of a jaw, a certain rhythm of interrupting, a certain way of going quiet when displeased, any of these can be enough to catch, which is why a person can be drained by someone who is nothing at all like the original figure on the surface, and everything like them underneath. Second, consider a correction that matters more than it looks. You have very likely heard a line passed around, as though it came straight from Jung's own pen, that we hate in another whatever reminds us of ourselves, and it carries some truth in spirit, but the wording itself belongs to Hermann Hesse, not to Jung. And I raise this not to be pedantic, but because the difference matters. Jung's own claim was narrower, and in some ways sturdier. He wrote that we discover in our neighbor whatever it is that we do not want to know about ourselves. Discover, not simply hate. And that word discover opens the door much wider than hatred ever could. Because the instant drain is not always anger. Sometimes it is a strange, fascinated repulsion you cannot quite name. Sometimes it is discomfort, with no clear edges. sometimes, and this one surprises people most, it is envy dressed up as irritation. Hatred is only the loudest member of a much larger family, and if you only ever search for what you hate, you will miss most of what is actually being discovered. Imagine a man who cannot stand a particular acquaintance's habit of speaking about his own feelings so openly, at parties, at work, without any of the usual reserve. The man calls it oversharing, calls it exhausting, tells his wife on the drive home that the fellow has no boundaries at all. And yet, if he sat with it honestly for even 5 minutes, he might notice that underneath the irritation is something closer to longing, a wish that he himself had ever once been allowed to speak that plainly about what he felt. The drain was doing double duty that whole evening, wearing the mask of disapproval over a face of quiet envy. And disapproval is so much easier to sit with than envy, which is precisely why the disguise gets used so often. Third, and this is the piece most people never reach because it asks for real honesty, consider the plain economics underneath all of it. Jung's model of the psyche treats attention and feeling as something closer to a currency than a mood, finite, spendable, and every unacknowledged part of you that has to be kept quietly below the surface requires a guard posted at that door, day and night, without holidays, and that guard's wages come directly out of your own account, not someone else's, so when a certain person appears and the drain hits you instantly, part of what you are feeling in that moment is the overtime bill for a guard you had honestly forgotten you were even paying. The door strains a little, the guard tenses at his post, and the person standing outside has simply knocked louder than usual on a door you had been quietly holding shut for years. Picture an ordinary Tuesday. A woman sits down at her desk, and a message arrives from a colleague she cannot quite stand. Before she has even opened it, her jaw is tight, her breathing has shortened. A full 2 minutes of her morning are gone before a single word has been read. That 2 minutes did not come from nowhere. It came out of the same account that pays the guard, the same account that keeps a much older feeling locked quietly out of view. And by lunchtime, when she wonders why she feels so unaccountably tired for such an unremarkable morning, the answer is sitting in that ledger the whole time. This reframes the whole experience from the ground up. The exhaustion was never really free-floating weather. It had an address the entire time. It belonged to an old repression, an unlived quality, a grief never finished, a talent never used, an anger never once spoken aloud. And the encounter with this particular person merely delivered the invoice on a debt that was already accruing interest quietly in the dark. Fourth, and here is the turn worth sitting with longest, this mechanism is not only true of the difficult people in your life. Ask yourself plainly, and without flinching, is there anyone whose energy, whose ease, whose visible success drains you in a stranger, quieter way? A kind of tired envy rather than anger, a heaviness you feel almost guilty admitting to, because that too is a hook. Only this one points toward gold you have not yet claimed, rather than darkness you have not yet faced. Picture a man who feels strangely depleted every time a certain friend casually mentions some new success. No cruelty in the friend's words, no boasting even, and still the man leaves feeling smaller, and if he is honest with himself in a quiet hour, he may find not resentment, but a kind of homesickness. For some ambition of his own he set down years ago and never picked back up. Either direction the hook can point, dark or gold, the underlying mechanism stays exactly the same. Something in you recognized something in them long before your conscious mind was ever given a vote in the matter, and the recognition arrived first as exhaustion, because that is often the only language the unconscious has available when the door has been shut for so long. And notice, before we close this key, that the 4 pieces are really one piece seen from 4 angles. The specific shape of the hook, the wide family of feeling it can wear, the hidden bill it charges you daily, and the double direction it can point, all of them are simply different windows onto the same locked room, and the drain you feel is only ever the sound of someone knocking on a door you had forgotten was closed. I stop paying the guard and start paying attention instead. The sixth key is this: once the hook is seen, the same person can remain in your life without draining you the way they used to, and that is a gentler ending than most people expect. Nothing here has asked you to forgive anyone prematurely, or to pretend a real difficulty was never real. Ordinary tiredness stays ordinary. A truly demanding person still asks something real of you. None of that changes. What changes is the instant part, the disproportion, the 90-second hollowing out that used to arrive before a single word was exchanged, because that particular drain was never really about them carrying your fatigue toward you. It was about an old, unclaimed piece of yourself finally being handed back. Imagine a woman who spent years dreading a certain relative's visits. The tightness would start days in advance, a small dread that sat in her stomach like a stone she had learned to carry without noticing its weight. And then one ordinary autumn, after months of quietly tracing the pattern, admitting the old scene it rhymed with, bringing the borrowed energy home piece by piece, the relative arrives again. Same voice, same manner, same small comments that once could empty a whole afternoon, and she notices, almost with disbelief, that she is simply tired, the way anyone might be tired after a long visit. Nothing more. The stone is gone, not because the relative changed a single thing about themselves, but because the guard that used to stand at her door has finally been allowed to rest. Now picture the same recognition landing somewhere smaller and more ordinary. A Tuesday at work. A manager whose clipped tone once sent a jolt through your whole afternoon. You have traced the pattern, you have brought the energy home, and the manager says the very same clipped sentence she has said 100 times before, and something in you simply notes it. Mildly, the way you would note weather, a little brisk today, nothing more. You are not warmer toward her. You are not colder. You are simply no longer paying an old debt on her account. And this is worth saying plainly, because it is often misunderstood. The goal was never to feel nothing around difficult people. Warmth for difficult people is not the target. And neither is icy detachment. The target is proportion, a reaction the same size as the actual moment. No more borrowed dread, no more invoice arriving before a word is even spoken. When the hook is seen and the energy comes home, you may still choose distance, you may still choose closer contact, but now the choosing is yours, made with clear eyes, rather than made for you by an old current running underneath the surface. This is what Jung meant by the slow, unglamorous work of making the unconscious conscious. Not a single dramatic breakthrough, but 1,000 small withdrawals, 1,000 small admissions, each one returning a little more of your own current to your own hands, and there will be relapses. An old tightness may flare again on a harder day, and that is not failure. That is simply the guard checking the door out of old habit before remembering it can finally stand down, until the day comes, quietly, almost without ceremony, when the very face that used to hollow you out in 90 seconds simply walks into the room, and the room, for once, stays standing. I meet people now with the energy I used to leave behind. Here is the whole picture. The drain measures the hook, not the person. The hook is a projection, the world briefly wearing your own unknown face. The pattern has a schedule you can trace across an ordinary day. The way through is withdrawal, bringing the loaned energy home rather than simply gaining distance. Underneath it all is an old repression standing guard, and what it hides may be darkness, or it may be unclaimed gold. And once you see the hook clearly, the same person can stay in the room while the exhaustion quietly stops arriving before they even speak. All 6 of these were never 6 separate keys at all. They were one single turning. Look at the hook, and the drain begins to loosen its grip on its own. None of this asks you to become suspicious of every hard feeling or to distrust your own honest tiredness. Some exhaustion is simply the weather of a long day and needs no theory at all. But the instant kind, the kind that arrives before the facts do, has been trying to tell you something for a long time. And it was never really about them. Not entirely. Say it once more with me. I make the unconscious conscious. And hold that quietly for a moment. So the next time a certain face walks into the room, and something in you tightens before a word is spoken. Ask yourself gently, whose energy is this really, and whose face is only borrowing it for now?